A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. Abraham Lincoln, 1858.
2 years before Abraham Lincoln became president, he could see great trouble brewing between the northern and southern states. They had been arguing for a whole generation, in Congress, in newspapers, in books, and face-to-face. By the time Lincoln became president in 1861, the House was falling, the Union was crumbling. Slavery, illegal in the North and depended upon in the South, was a major factor in their arguments. But there was more. The two regions were very different. They had different cultures and economies, different ideas of how a society should be run and what the Constitution meant, different goals for the country. Both feared the other was getting more than their fair share from the federal government. They were losing their ability to compromise. March 1861, South Carolina secedes from the Union. Soon after, 10 other states in the Deep South joined South Carolina to form the Confederate States of America. Within the year, the North and South were at war. The Civil War would split the nation in two. It would rage on for 4 years, 600,000 lives, and wound many more in body and spirit. A bloody war that at times pitted brother against brother. American men, some as young as 15 and 16 years old, slaughtered each other in small-town streets, wheat fields, and apple orchards. Whole cities were destroyed. How could this happen in America? The North and South had always had their disagreements, but they had been able to put them aside to form a union, the United States of America. So what changed? Why did Southern states decide to split from the North? What brought on the unimaginable horrors that nearly split America forever? In the early 1800s, America was growing in leaps and bounds. In the North, internal improvements and trade were the order of the day. Investors poured millions of dollars into transportation systems that would connect one region to the next for the benefits of trade. Completion of the Erie Canal made its investors wealthy men as food and produce poured into New York from the west and manufactured goods floated to the interior. A building boom in canals quickly followed. When Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb puffed out of Baltimore in 1830, few thought much of it. But by 1860, 9,000 miles of railroads linked the nation together. Europe, too, grew closer as the shift from sail to steam engine cut the travel time to Liverpool from New York from 49 to only 14 days. Most people still worked on farms, but the North was rapidly industrializing. Using new machines and interchangeable parts, northern factories poured out sewing machines, farm machinery, clothing, and other goods. Americans were so good at it that the British called the making of things by machine, rather than hand, the American system of manufacturing. Industry created jobs. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany and teenagers from American farms poured into northern cities like Lowell, Massachusetts and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to work as wage earners in factories. Stores sprung up, shelves brimming with goods to sell to workers. Banks sprung up to finance business and trade. A booming market economy was transforming the North. Life was quite different in the South. There, agriculture was the major source of jobs and wealth. Long growing seasons and rich soil produced rice, tobacco, and cotton, cash crops grown for sale in distant markets. The vast majority of Southern whites were poor farmers who eked out a living as best they could. But big plantation owners with many slaves dominated the South. economically, socially, and politically. The North had outlawed slavery in the decades following the American Revolution. Back then, many Americans believed that slavery would die out on its own because it was no longer profitable. But then something happened. Raw cotton had always been very expensive because it took too long to separate the sticky seeds from the fiber. Then, in 1793, Eli Whitney, a young teacher from New England, invented the cotton gin. With this simple machine, a slave could clean more than 50 pounds of cotton a day. The cotton gin transformed cotton from a luxury item into the world's cheapest fabric. Booming textile factories in the northern states and England paid good money for all they could get, and the South was the world's major supplier.
There was a bigger demand for cotton, and in order to get that cotton, the South needed a lot of land. To work the land, they needed a large labor force, and the largest, cheapest labor force available was the enslaved African.
Doubling in value every 10 years, cotton production soon dominated the Southern economy. The Cotton Belt spread west across the South. Close to 1 million slaves were marched in chains to the southern frontier, where they cleared land and grew cotton to make their masters rich.
So by the end of the second decade of the 19th century, the states in the South, the Deep South, were really committed to slavery because it gave them an economic advantage.
The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran the fastest, there he whipped the longest.
Southern wealth rested on the backs of slaves. Even though some slave owners treated their slaves well, Southern slavery was brutal, degrading, and deadly. Dressed only in coarse linen clothing, children received only 2 shirts a year. When these failed them, they went naked, winter or summer. It was not uncommon for slaves to work from dawn to dusk, then do their own washing, mending, and cooking before falling to sleep. They slept on cold, damp, bare floors, often with only a coarse blanket, even in the cold of winter. Slaves considered a good master one who gave them enough to fill their stomachs. Many had barely enough to eat. Believing that slaves couldn't be governed except with the whip, masters and overseers beat men and women, young and old, even pregnant women, for any reason or for none. Born a slave in Maryland, Frederick Douglass revealed the hardships and horrors of slavery in his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. According to Douglass, to be accused was to be convicted, and to be convicted was to be punished.
Frederick Douglass in his autobiography talks about seeing a young mother beaten while her children watched, unable to do anything to stop them. And this is something that's hard for us to understand, but we just need to remember that the enslaved people were not considered people. They were considered property.
Slavery, Douglass observed, was dehumanizing, not only to the slave, but to the slaveholder as well. He would watch it turn his own mistress's tender heart to a stone. Before she learned how to be a proper slave master, his mistress did, however, give Douglass a gift that transformed his life. She taught him to read.
When she started to teach her son to read, she also taught Frederick, and she called her husband in to show him how quickly he had learned to read. And as soon as her husband saw Frederick with a book, he snatched it away and told her, "You must never teach a slave to read or to write."
A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master. If you teach that nigger how to read, there would be no keeping him.
These words burned in Douglass. He read and learned whenever he could. As it turned out, there was no keeping him. Douglass escaped in 1838 and soon thereafter became one of America's most powerful voices against slavery. Not every black man and woman in the South was a slave.
In the 1800s, during the period that slavery was still very much alive in this country, there were tens of thousands, actually, of African people, people of African descent, who were freed, one way or another. They had run away, They had managed to get free after their slave owners died. Their relatives bought them out. And sometimes out of conscience, people would release their slaves.
Some of them traveled north, particularly places like Philadelphia, and increased the black population. And it was through free black community building that the modern black community emerged, so with churches, with organizations, with a sense of self. And even as they tried to become Americans, they also wanted to hold on to this separate identity. So it was a free black population that was increasingly conscious of its place in America and its need to define its place in America.